First contact with the void. Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the massive display screen at the Quantum Boundary Research Facility, her eyes fixed on the impossible readings before her. The quantum sensors had picked up something that shouldn't exist, a region of space that seemed to actively resist the laws of physics themselves. Dr. Chen, we're getting those anomalous readings again, her assistant, Marcus Wong, called from his station. They're stronger this time. Whatever's out there, it's pulsing. The discovery had come 3 months ago, when their deep space array had detected a perfect sphere of nothingness, approximately 2.3 light-years from Earth. Not empty space that they could understand, but a complete absence of everything, including the quantum foam that pervaded the universe itself. Sarah ran her fingers through her graying hair, a habit she'd developed over 20 years of quantum physics research. "Show me the temporal displacement graphs," she said, moving closer to Marcus's workstation. The holographic display flickered to life, showing a three-dimensional representation of the void's boundaries. What they saw defied explanation. Regions where time itself seemed to flow backwards, sideways, or not at all. "We're losing another probe," Marcus announced, his voice tight with frustration. It was their 7th attempt to send an automated probe into the anomaly. Each time, the machines had failed in different, impossible ways. The first had simply ceased to exist. The second had appeared to age millions of years in an instant. The third had somehow returned before it had been launched. But this time was different. As they watched the telemetry from Probe 7, something unexpected happened. The data stream didn't cut off abruptly like the others. Instead, it began transmitting information that made Sarah's heart race. "Marcus, are you seeing this?" she whispered, leaning forward until her nose nearly touched the screen. "These patterns, they're not random." The stream of data coming back from the probe showed regular, repeating sequences, too regular to be natural phenomena. But what struck Sarah wasn't just the patterns themselves, but their familiarity. They resembled neural firing patterns, but on a cosmic scale. "Get me a secure line to the director," Sarah ordered, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And Marcus, download everything. Multiple copies, multiple locations. If I'm right about this, we're not just looking at an anomaly. We're looking at something that's looking back." The next 48 hours became a blur of activity. The facility transformed from a quiet research station into a hub of frenzied preparation. Director Hayes had immediately understood the implications of Sarah's discovery and initiated Protocol Omega, the predetermined response to potential first contact. But as Sarah worked with her team to analyze the data, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. The patterns weren't just similar to neural activity, they were responding to their probes. Each time they'd sent a machine into the void, the patterns had changed, adapted, almost as if. "It's learning," she announced during the emergency briefing with world leaders and scientific advisors. "Whatever exists in that region of anti-space, it's studying us as much as we're studying it. And I believe it's been doing so for a very long time." The revelation sparked intense debate. Some argued for immediate cessation of all probe activities, fearing what they might provoke. Others pushed for more aggressive exploration. But Sarah had a different proposal. "We need to send something new," she explained, pulling up the designs she'd been working on. "Not just another probe, but something that can survive in anti-space by embracing its impossible nature. We've been trying to force our physics onto it, but what if we did the opposite?" Her proposal was radical. A probe designed to operate on principles that violated known physics, built to function in a realm where our universal constants were more like variables. It would carry a quantum-encrypted message, not in conventional language, but in the very patterns they detected from the void. As she finished presenting her plan, Sarah felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Humanity stood on the brink of something unprecedented, not just contact with alien intelligence, but contact with something that existed in a way they had never imagined possible. "We'll need time to build it," she concluded, "but more importantly, we need to be ready for the response. Because I don't think we're dealing with just one entity out there. The patterns suggest a vast network of consciousness spanning the anti-space, and now they know we're here. The assembly fell silent, the implications of her words sinking in. In the quiet, Sarah thought about all the failed probes, all the impossible readings, and all the assumptions they'd made about the nature of reality itself. Perhaps the void wasn't empty at all. Perhaps it was full of something they simply hadn't been able to perceive until now. As the facility hummed with renewed purpose, Sarah returned to her lab, Marcus close behind. They had work to do, and humanity's first real step into anti-space would require everything they had learned, everything they could imagine, and perhaps most importantly, everything they were willing to unlearn about the nature of existence itself. The void waited, watching, and for the first time, Sarah wondered if it was as curious about them as they were about it. She pulled up the latest data streams, settled into her chair, and began to work on the message they would send into the impossible darkness. Whatever waited out there, humanity was ready to say hello. The observer effect. The new probe looked wrong. There was no other way to describe it. Its geometry seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, and its surface displayed colors that shouldn't exist. Dr. Sarah Chen had expected this. After all, they'd designed it to operate in a realm where conventional physics broke down. Final diagnostic check complete, Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the launch facility's control room. Quantum stabilizers are, well, as unstable as intended. Sarah nodded, her attention fixed on the launch countdown. The probe, officially designated QV-8 but nicknamed Impossible by the engineering team, represented 6 months of work and more theoretical physics breakthroughs than she could count. They'd built it using principles derived from their observations of anti-space, incorporating materials and configurations that should fail catastrophically in normal space but might, just might, survive in the void. T-minus 60 seconds, the automated system announced. Director Hayes stood beside Sarah, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of anxiety. The Security Council is watching this launch very closely, Dr. Chen. After your last report about the consciousness you detected, they're concerned about potential risks. With respect, Director, Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the screens. I'm more concerned about what happens if we don't make contact. Whatever's out there, it's aware of us now, and it's waiting. The last 3 months had brought more evidence of intelligent activity within the void. The neural-like patterns had become more complex, more focused. Sometimes they seemed to form what Sarah's team had started calling questions, repeating sequences that modified slightly with each probe they sent, as if testing different approaches to communication. T-minus 30 seconds. Sarah touched the small quantum receiver she wore on a chain around her neck. Unlike traditional communication devices, this one was designed to detect and record the same impossible patterns they'd observed from the void. If their theories were correct, it might allow them to receive messages from the probe even if conventional signals failed. T-minus 10 seconds. 9. 8. The launch facility fell silent. Sarah held her breath, feeling the weight of humanity's hopes riding on this moment. 3, 2, 1. Launch. QV-8 didn't so much launch as phase out of reality. The specially designed quantum drive engaged, and the probe seemed to fold in on itself, becoming a point of absolute darkness before disappearing entirely. Telemetry is processing, Marcus reported, his fingers flying over his console. Quantum signature stable. Position tracking, confirmed. It's approaching the void boundary. This was the moment where all previous probes had failed. Sarah's hand unconsciously gripped her quantum receiver as she watched the data streams. The probe's approach was different this time. Instead of trying to pierce the boundary of anti-space, it was designed to resonate with it, to become compatible with the impossible physics within. Boundary contact in 3, 2, 1. The control room erupted in gasps and murmurs. On the main screen, they could see QV-8's sensor feed. The probe hadn't disintegrated or vanished. Instead, it was transmitting data from within the void itself. "It worked," Sarah whispered. Then louder, "It worked. Marcus, start the broadcast sequence." The probe began transmitting their carefully crafted message, a complex series of quantum states that mimicked the patterns they'd observed from the void. For several tense minutes they waited, watching the data streams for any response. Sarah's quantum receiver suddenly grew warm against her skin. She pulled it out, watching as its display came alive with shifting patterns. "Look at this," she called out, connecting the receiver to the main system. "We're getting a response, but not through the probe's channels." The patterns cascaded across the screens, more complex and intricate than anything they'd seen before. As their systems processed the data, something unprecedented began to happen. The patterns began to resolve into images, impossible geometries and structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human minds could comprehend. And then, something changed. The images shifted, simplified, became almost accommodating. It was as if whatever was communicating with them had recognized their limitations and was adapting its message to be more comprehensible. "It's learning our language," Sarah realized aloud. "Not English or any human language, but the language of our reality. It's translating itself." The message that emerged was both simple and earth-shattering. Through mathematical constants and quantum relationships, the entity in the void conveyed a fundamental truth. It was not alone. The anti-space was home to countless consciousnesses, existing in ways humanity couldn't fully comprehend. And they had been watching, waiting for a species to achieve the ability to reach across the boundary. But what came next changed everything. The entity revealed that humanity wasn't chosen by chance. There was something unique about human consciousness, something that made them particularly suited to bridge the gap between normal space and anti-space. The failed probes hadn't been failures at all. They had been tests, measuring humanity's approach to solving an impossible problem. As Sarah and her team worked to process and understand the flood of information, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of reality. The void wasn't a place where nothing could survive. It was a place where everything that couldn't exist in our universe found its home. "Dr. Chen," Marcus called out, his voice shaking slightly. "The probe's sensors are picking up movement within the void. Something's approaching it." The entire control room watched in stunned silence as their sensors detected a vast consciousness moving closer to QV8. The probe's quantum sensors registered patterns of impossible complexity, suggesting a being of enormous intelligence and capability. Sarah's quantum receiver grew warmer, and new patterns began to emerge. This time, the message was clear. They were being invited deeper into the void. The consciousness wasn't just communicating, it was offering to guide them. As she looked around the control room at her colleagues' awestruck faces, Sarah knew they stood at a crossroads. Humanity could retreat from this precipice, return to the comfortable certainties of their known physics and limited understanding. Or they could take the next step, accept the invitation, and learn what it truly meant to exist in a universe far stranger and more wonderful than they had imagined. Director Hayes broke the silence. "Dr. Chen, what are your recommendations?" Sarah took a deep breath, her decision already made. "We need to build something bigger than a probe," she said. "We need to build a ship." Echoes of life. 18 months later, Sarah stood in the observation deck of the International Space Assembly Facility, watching as construction drones swarmed around humanity's first anti-space vessel. The ship, named Threshold, looked as impossible as the probe that had preceded it. Its hull seemed to bend light in ways that made observers' eyes water, and its quantum core pulsed with energies that their instruments struggled to measure. "The neural interface systems are ready for final testing," Marcus reported, now sporting a few more gray hairs than when their journey had begun. "Though I still think you're crazy for volunteering to be the first pilot." Sarah smiled, though her expression held a hint of tension. The neural interface was perhaps the most controversial aspect of the Threshold project. Traditional controls wouldn't work in anti-space. They needed a way to navigate using pure consciousness, guided by the patterns they'd learned from their void-dwelling contacts. "Someone has to do it," she replied, touching her quantum receiver, now modified and integrated into a full neural upload system. "And I've spent more time studying their patterns than anyone else." The past year and a half had brought remarkable breakthroughs in their understanding of anti-space. The consciousness they'd contacted, which they'd named the Observer, had shared insights that transformed their understanding of physics, consciousness, and reality itself. But more intriguingly, it had begun sharing fragments of history, hints of other civilizations that had reached across the void. Dr. Chen, a young technician, approached, tablet in hand. "We've decoded another set of pattern fragments from the Observer. You'll want to see this." The data showed something unprecedented, clear evidence of artificial structures within the void. Not just quantum patterns or consciousness signatures, but actual physical constructions that somehow maintain stability in anti-space. They appeared ancient, predating humanity's civilization by millions of years. "It's a waypoint system," Sarah realized, studying the patterns. "The Observer is showing us a network of navigation markers left by previous visitors to anti-space. But why show us this now?" The answer came that evening, as Sarah worked late in her lab. Her quantum receiver picked up a new transmission, more urgent than the usual patterns. As she processed the data, her eyes widened. "Get me Director Hayes," she called out to the lab's eye. "Priority 1. When Hayes arrived, Sarah had already compiled her findings into a holographic display. "The ancient structures aren't just waypoints," she explained, manipulating the complex 3D model before them. "They're warnings. Something happened to those civilizations, something that the Observer and its kind have been trying to prevent from happening again." The hologram showed a progression of civilizations discovering anti-space, building their impossible structures, and then vanishing. Not through violence or catastrophe, but through a kind of transcendence that went wrong. They had tried to migrate their entire species into anti-space, abandoning their original reality. "And they failed?" Hayes asked, studying the patterns. "Worse," Sarah replied. "They succeeded, but they lost something essential in the process. The Observer's kind believe that consciousness requires both realities to exist in balance. These civilizations, by fully embracing anti-space, became something less than they were. They forgot their origins, their purpose, their very nature." She manipulated the display, showing the threshold's unique design. "That's why our ship is different. It's not just designed to visit anti-space. It's designed to maintain its connection to our reality. The Observer has been guiding us to build something that's never existed before, a true bridge between realities." The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just exploring anti-space. They were attempting something unprecedented, maintaining consciousness in both realities simultaneously. The ancient ruins would serve as both guideposts and cautionary tales. As the launch date approached, Sarah spent more time interfacing with the quantum receiver, preparing her mind for what was to come. The patterns had become almost familiar now, like a language she was slowly learning to speak. But sometimes, in the depths of these communications, she sensed something else, a vast, patient intelligence that seemed to be watching their progress with intense interest. 3 days before the scheduled launch, she made another breakthrough. Hidden within the Observer's transmissions about the ancient ruins was something else, a message that had taken their systems months to decode. It was a warning, but not about the dangers of transcendence. "There's something else out there," she told Hayes during their final briefing. "Something that exists in the space between realities. The ancient civilizations didn't just transcend. They were running from something. And now, after eons of silence, our experiments with anti-space have attracted its attention." The launch countdown began with this new weight of knowledge. As Sarah prepared to board the threshold, she understood that they weren't just embarking on an exploration mission. They were taking the first steps in a journey that might determine the fate of not one reality, but two. The ship's quantum core hummed to life, its impossible geometries beginning to resonate with the void. As Sarah settled into the neural interface cradle, she felt the patterns of anti-space beginning to merge with her consciousness. Through the ship's sensors, she could already sense the observer waiting, ready to guide them through the boundary. But beyond that boundary, in the depths of anti-space, something else was stirring, something that had waited countless ages for a species capable of bridging realities. And as the threshold prepared to make history, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover why the ancient civilizations had left behind warnings instead of welcomes. The bridge between. The transition into anti-space felt like dying and being born simultaneously. Sarah's consciousness stretched and compressed in ways her human mind struggled to comprehend as the threshold crossed the boundary. The neural interface translated impossible sensations into something her brain could process, but the experience was still overwhelming. Status report. She managed to communicate back to Earth, her thoughts carried through the quantum receiver network they'd established. The response came not in words, but in patterns, mission control confirming their successful crossing. Through the ship's sensors, augmented by her neural connection, Sarah perceived anti-space for the first time as more than just data. It was alive with consciousness, filled with patterns of thought and existence that defied conventional understanding. The observer's presence became clear, a vast, ancient intelligence that seemed to extend through multiple dimensions. "We've made it," she broadcast, both to Earth and to the observer. "Humanity has crossed the boundary." The observer's response came not in patterns this time, but in direct neural communication. Images and concepts flooded Sarah's mind. The history of anti-space, the rise and fall of civilizations, and the true nature of the threat they faced. In the space between realities, something had evolved, an entity that fed on consciousness itself. The ancient civilizations hadn't just transcended. They'd fled from this predator, seeking refuge in full transformation to escape its hunger. But in doing so, they'd lost the very thing that made them unique, the ability to exist in both realities simultaneously. "Marcus," Sarah called through the quantum link, "are you receiving these readings? The ancient structures, they're not just waypoints or warnings. They're weapons." The ruins they detected were part of a defense network, built by multiple civilizations over millions of years. Each had tried to fight the entity in their own way, and each had failed, eventually choosing transcendence as their only escape. But the observer and its kind had recognized something different in humanity. Unlike previous species that had discovered anti-space, humans had an unusual ability to adapt, to exist in contradictions. The quantum receiver technology they'd developed wasn't just a communication tool, it was proof of this unique trait. The threshold shuddered as something massive moved through anti-space nearby. Sarah felt it through the neural interface, a presence that seemed to devour the very patterns of consciousness around it. The entity had noticed them. Initiating defense protocols, Sarah broadcast, activating systems they'd built into the ship based on the observer's guidance. The threshold's quantum core pulsed, creating a barrier of structured consciousness around the vessel. The entity's attack came not as a physical force, but as an assault on reality itself. It tried to unravel the quantum states that allowed the threshold to exist in anti-space, seeking to either destroy the ship or force its complete transformation into anti-space matter. But the observer had prepared them for this. The ship's hybrid nature, simultaneously existing in normal space and anti-space, made it resistant to the entity's influence. Sarah felt the ancient intelligence joining with her consciousness, showing her how to maintain this delicate balance. "It's not just attacking the ship," she realized, communicating urgently with Earth. "It's trying to force our evolution. This is what happened to the others. It pushed them to transcend before they were ready, corrupting the process." Through the neural interface, Sarah could sense the entity's frustration. Humanity's ship wasn't following the pattern it had seen countless times before. The threshold remained stubbornly anchored in both realities, refusing to fully transform. "That's it," Sarah whispered, a plan forming in her mind. We don't need to fight it. We need to show it another way. Using the neural interface, she began broadcasting not just patterns, but the full complexity of human consciousness, their ability to hold contradictory thoughts, to exist in uncertainty, to bridge opposing concepts. The observer joined her, amplifying the transmission. The entity's attack faltered. For the first time in its ancient existence, it encountered something it couldn't categorize as belonging to either reality. The threshold wasn't just a ship, it was a demonstration of a third path, a way of existing that embraced both realities without being consumed by either. Beyond the impossible. Dr. Chen, your neural patterns are reaching critical levels. Marcus's voice cut through the quantum link, thick with concern. You need to disengage. But Sarah could see something now that her human eyes had never been capable of perceiving. Through the neural interface, augmented by the observer's ancient wisdom, she understood the true nature of both realities and the entity that existed between them. It's not our enemy, she transmitted, her consciousness stretching to encompass both the normal space and anti-space aspects of reality. It's a fragment of the original consciousness that existed before the universe split into two realities. It's been trying to force reunification the only way it knew how. The entity's presence loomed around the threshold, its ancient awareness focused on the unprecedented bridge that Sarah and her ship represented. Through their connection, she could sense its loneliness, its desperate drive to end the separation between realities that had torn it apart eons ago. We can help you, Sarah projected, not in patterns or words, but in pure consciousness, not by choosing one reality over the other, but by showing you how to exist in both simultaneously. The quantum core of the threshold pulsed with impossible energy as Sarah directed its power not at fighting the entity, but at creating a stable interface between realities. The observer joined her efforts, its vast intelligence helping to structure the bridge she was building. Through their quantum link, the mission control team on Earth watched in awe as readings they'd never thought possible began streaming in. The boundary between realities wasn't just becoming permeable, it was transforming into something entirely new. The ancient civilizations, Sarah transmitted, her thoughts becoming clearer as she adjusted to her expanded consciousness. They weren't meant to transcend completely. They were meant to be bridges, just like us. But without understanding both sides, they couldn't maintain the balance. The entity's response came not as an attack this time, but as a tentative exploration of the bridge Sarah had created. Through the neural interface, she felt its ancient consciousness beginning to understand what humanity had achieved, a way to exist in multiple states of reality without losing coherence. From the depths of anti-space, the transformed civilizations began to stir. The bridge Sarah had created was affecting them too, reawakening aspects of their consciousness that had been dormant since their transcendence. They were remembering what it meant to exist in both realities, to be whole again. It's working, Marcus reported through the quantum link. We're detecting quantum resonance patterns from the ancient structures. They're reactivating. The defense network built by countless civilizations over millions of years wasn't just a weapon. It was a framework, waiting for the right moment, the right species to complete its true purpose. The threshold's quantum core synchronized with these ancient machines, expanding the bridge between realities to encompass them all. Sarah felt her consciousness straining against human limitations as she coordinated this massive effort. The neural interface was operating far beyond its design parameters, trying to process the complexity of existing in multiple realities simultaneously. Sarah, the observer, communicated directly to her mind. You must complete the integration soon. Even with our help, your biological form cannot sustain this level of consciousness expansion indefinitely. She knew the observer was right. Already, she could feel the physical effects of maintaining the bridge, neurons firing in impossible patterns, her very atoms struggling to exist in multiple states of reality. But she could also see that they were nearly there, nearly at the point where the bridge would become self-sustaining. The entity made its decision. Instead of fighting against the bridge or trying to force complete transcendence, It began to adapt, to learn this new way of existing. Its consciousness, vast and ancient, started to flow through the pathways Sarah had created, no longer seeking to devour awareness, but to connect it. Look, Sarah transmitted to Earth, sharing through the quantum link what she could perceive. The ancient civilizations, they're returning. Not completely, not physically, but their consciousness is finding balance again. Through the bridge, these long-lost species began to re-establish contact with normal space, their awareness flowing back and forth between realities. They had found what they had been searching for all along, not transcendence, but harmony. The entity, too, was transforming. As it learned to exist in both realities simultaneously, its original purpose became clear. It hadn't been trying to destroy consciousness or force evolution. It had been trying to heal a wound in reality itself, to restore a connection that had been lost at the beginning of time. Sarah initiated the Threshold's return sequence, knowing her work was nearly complete. The bridge would remain, sustained by the ancient machines and the newly balanced consciousnesses that now populated both realities. Humanity had done what no other species had managed. They had found a way to exist in contradiction, to be both here and not here, to maintain awareness across the spectrum of reality itself. As the ship began its transition back to normal space, Sarah felt the observer's final message. You have succeeded where others could not because you never sought to abandon one reality for another. You understood that true transcendence isn't about escape, it's about connection. The threshold emerged from anti-space, its quantum core humming with the energy of two realities in harmony. Sarah disengaged from the neural interface, her human consciousness settling back into her body, though forever changed by the experience. Send word to the director, she told Marcus as soon as she could speak again. Tell him we didn't just find something alive in anti-space. We found a way to make everything more alive. In the void between realities, the entity continued its ancient work, but now as a guardian of connection, rather than a force of transformation. The observer and its kind watched over the bridge humanity had built, while the consciousness of ancient civilizations began the long process of relearning what it meant to exist in balance. And on Earth, as humanity began to process the implications of what they had achieved, Sarah Chen looked up at the stars with new understanding. They had been wrong about anti-space all along. Nothing could survive there alone, but together, in connection, everything could thrive.